Much like Tony Stark in Iron Man 2 at the Expo, it's good to be back, and we have a new defensive coach to talk about. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time. Once again for Locked On Ducks, I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. If you haven't already, please like, comment, subscribe wherever you listen to or watch this show. Thank you to everybody who has done so already, and thank you all for being patient with me this week. Technology. That's all I've got to say. But I've got plenty more to say right now about Oregon's newest coach on the staff, specifically on the defensive side of the ball. His name is Chris Hampton. We'll hear even more about him in depth on tomorrow's show from someone who knows Coach Hampton very, very well, because he was formerly, until he accepted this position with the Ducks, the defensive coordinator at Tulane. Now, he is filling the role left by Matt Powledge. He is filling the same title as the safeties coach and co-defensive coordinator. That is a tidbit I will be touching on after I give you a little bit of background on this guy. From 2016 to 2019, he was at Tulane as the defensive backs coach. That is how you pronounce it, by the way. Got to have the 2 in there for the Green Wave. Then he was the DB coach at Duke, making the G5 to Power 5 jump. But then for the last 2 seasons, not 1 but 2, he has been the defensive coordinator for Tulane again. He also had several coaching stops prior to these places. This is a guy who has been around quite a bit. He's not that old. He played college football, I believe, in like the early 2000s, early to mid, in that sort of range. So it's continuing with the theme that we've seen for Dan Lanning's staff, and that's he's hiring a lot of young guys. That is very deliberate on his part. I think that's partially a recruiting play. I think part of that is a connections play as well, right? He's talked about the Rolodex of cards that he's got, of coaches who he's met over the years, who he likes, who he'd consider for when he got a head coaching opportunity, which Oregon, of course, has given him his very first. So this is a guy who has had some success as a defensive coordinator. Tulane's defense this year, might I remind you, this is a Tulane program that had one of the greatest single-season turnarounds literally in the history of college football. Greater than USC's, greater than Washington's this year. They were a 2-win team a season ago in the American. They win the conference this year. Think about how insane that is. And their head coach deserves a lot of credit. But you have to have a great staff too, if you are going to undergo that big of a one-season transformation at a group of 5 school that has no real history of winning college football games. They were a 2-win team last year. They turn around, went 10-2 in the regular season, including a win over Kansas State, the Big 12 champions, might I remind you. They were a 12-game winner after they won both the American Athletic Conference Championship game and the Cotton Bowl against USC. That was a good football team this year. And their defense gave up a lot of points to USC. Guess what? So did everybody else except Oregon State, which is more a testament to the Beavs defense and how good it was this year. Oregon put up 34. That's pretty darn good. But the defense, as we know, is where the Ducks really need to get better going into next year. And Tulane's defense this season statistically was pretty darn good. And anytime you have someone coming from the G5 level, people will rightly ask. I think it's fair. I think it's a perfectly valid question to ask. Well, he's doing it against a lower level of competition. He's not going up against the USCs. Look at what happened when he did go up against USC. Well, he has the same, if not a lower level of talent, because it's Tulane compared to other teams in the American like Cincinnati or Houston or UCF that have a greater tradition of winning and probably recruit at a higher level. He is dealing with the caliber of players that are at least equivalent to what they have on the other side. They were 32nd in the country this year at 22.2 points per game allowed. That figure is, yes, lower than what Oregon allowed this year by about, I think, 5 or 6 points a game. They were 11th in the country, allowing just 43 plays of 20 or more yards. That's the biggest stat that I'd be interested to see if it can carry over to season one with the Ducks, because then you do go back to the point that I was talking about a moment ago of like sometimes Caleb Williams just makes an amazing play, or Michael Penix makes a really good throw, or any of the other players in the Pac-12, and there's not a lot you can do about it, and guys just make that sort of play. But still an encouraging trend because it speaks to the schematical capability that he's got here as a defensive coordinator. Again, something I'll be touching on in a moment. He coached 2 all-conference players. They were both defensive backs. One was a corner, one was a safety. They allowed 45 points to USC in the Cotton Bowl, but they also had a safety in that game against USC, and Oregon didn't have one of those this year. So here's the biggest question. Now that you have an understanding of kind of who this guy is, why would you go from a defensive coordinator position to a co-defensive coordinator position and safeties coach? And DBs is, I believe, what he played at South Carolina in college. It's what he has coached. And the move originally he made in his career trajectory from Tulane to Duke made a lot of sense there, because it was, you're a DB coach here, you're going to go be a defensive backs coach over here. But then he came back to Tulane to be a defensive coordinator. So why would a guy who is a defensive coordinator, the head coach, I don't know if they have an offensive or defensive coach, but the number 1 or 2 coach for an entire side of the ball, why would you go from that to this position at Oregon? It's a fascinating question. And I think it speaks to how Oregon's defense performed this year, which I'll be talking about a little bit later as well. Because when you bring in a guy of this caliber, I think it says one thing very, very clearly. Not that you should go check out BetOnline, but you should do that as well. And yes, I will tell you what the one thing is. But BetOnline is still your number 1 source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. From pro football to college bowl season to basketball and the World Cup, they have had it all. They will continue to have it all. Anything you want, we've got it all at betonline.net. If you love sports podcasts, you can find those at BetOnline as well. We're always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting information. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline is where the game starts. Let's answer this question of why would a defensive coordinator take a co-defensive coordinator role. Number 1, there is precedent in the coaching sphere. I've seen it more in the college ranks of someone is a head coach and they go to be an assistant somewhere else because that somewhere else is a bigger school, is a bigger program, and so it's more high profile, right? Like oftentimes an assistant coach will have had head coaching experience at a junior college level for a mid-major Division I program. That's pretty common. Or in football, a good example in the Pac-12, Eric Morris, who's the head coach at North Texas now, he took that job, but he was Washington State's OC this year. He was the head coach at Incarnate Word, and that's an FCS program. And so someone who's an FCS head coach can get a Division I FBS job, like Troy Taylor going from Sac State to Stanford. But other times, coaches will be willing to take an assistant job or a coordinator job when they're making a jump in competition level, when they're making a jump perhaps in pay, depending on the role. But I haven't seen this before where someone who is a full-time defensive coordinator makes a jump up and takes a co-defensive coordinator / position group role. Now, titles can be signatory or symbolic is the better word, and nothing more. And maybe it'll be a true collaborative effort. But I wonder, I seriously wonder if this is a guy who will come in and have a heavy hand in the defensive play calling. Because Lanning is not calling plays. He's probably not going to. I would love it if he could, but there are just too many responsibilities for a head coach at a Power 5 college football program. There are just too many. You're managing kids. You got to make sure they're in class. You got to make sure they've got grades. You have to recruit. You have to coach. You have to scheme. There are too many things for you to also be the play caller. And Tosh Lupoy was the defensive coordinator and still is, and will be the play caller, or was the play caller, I should say, in 2022. But I wonder if part of the pitch for Hampton to go from a defensive coordinator role to a co-defensive coordinator role, I really wonder if part of the pitch was you're either going to be the play caller or you and Tosh will both work that out. I really wonder that, because it's one thing to go from DB coach at Tulane to DB coach at Duke, but this is going from full-on defensive coordinator to co-defensive coordinator. That's a downgrade in title, an upgrade in caliber, and perhaps an upgrade in pay. I don't know. I don't know what Tulane's able to pay their assistant coaches there. Oregon probably is able to pay at least as much, maybe a little bit more. That's speculative on my part at this point in time until we maybe hear some more details on that front. But a guy with his track record, as experienced as he is, 2 years as a DC. Lupoy was a DC at Alabama, but then he went to the NFL. He wasn't calling plays there. He wasn't a defensive coordinator. He was a defensive line coach, right? That's kind of his specialty. And I think we're seeing that pay off in the recruiting front in a really big way. But we'd all agree the defensive play calling this year was not up to standard. It was not where it needs to be. And so a guy with that experience who's had success calling plays for the last couple of seasons, I wonder if he will be involved. Will we ever get that sort of information? Probably not. Because there was a fair amount of, I think, reasonable speculation as to whether or not Lanning was taking more charge in or actually making some play calls in that Utah game in which we allowed just 17 points. I wonder if this move is helping that process move along on that front to where Tosh is not the sole play caller, because it was not good enough this year. I mean, that's what getting beat on third down consistently is. And Oregon's third down defense was putrid this year. Not just on third and shorts, but on third and longs, on third and mediums. Like they were not good in a number of ways. That was the biggest thought I had when I saw hired a successful group of 5 defensive coordinator who just had a really good season. Something to definitely watch going forward. More on him tomorrow, but a little more on the defense he's taking over. Now, I am not here to say that the defense was good. However, this was still a 10-win team. Your defense cannot be atrocious just because your offense scores a bunch of points. Look at USC last year, right? They scored a lot of points, but they allowed too many, and they weren't good situationally, and they fell behind a lot of times. And when they went 4-8, not when they went 11-3 this year, obviously. But that was their offense just taking such a huge, massive leap forward, and Caleb Williams is ridiculous, as we will see at Autzen Stadium later this year. Schedule came out. Oh, so much juice. So much juice. That will be an upcoming topic on the show. But the defense that Hampton is coming into to be the co-defensive coordinator for was bad against Oregon State, arguably worse against Washington because the special teams were such a disaster against the Bees, but the defense was certainly bad. But this is not a defense that is miles and miles away from being good after what we saw this season. When you hear, a certain player is coming back, like Jamal Hill and Steve Stevens, for instance, again, that will be an upcoming segment on the show. We'll get to all of that sort of stuff. It's a natural reaction to think, well, the defense blew it in those big games, defense this, the defense that. Why should we want people back? Why should we want anybody back from the defense this year? Well, here's the important thing to remember. What I always say, statistics are a starting point, not an end point. And I do think a number of statistics, specifically the third down defense this year, was reflective of Oregon's poor performance on that side of the ball. But there's an important thing to remember here. A few things to remember. These are all scores that Oregon built up at different points in games this year. And your defense, I think, more often than not in these games, suffered from just letting up. And it didn't come back to bite us in any of these games, but then it did in the Oregon State game. And that's still a problem. And that still needs to be corrected. And that has to do with play calling. And that has to do with adjustments. And that has to do with guys being able to make plays. But these were all scores that Oregon had this year. Yes, it was an offensively driven team, for sure. BYU, it was 38-7. Yeah, they scored 13 points later. Well, did that feel really significant? No. Would you rather that not happen because then a game like Oregon State comes to pass where suddenly those few scores turn into a few more and then before you know it, you have a game? Yep, 100%. Not arguing that point. But it was a 38-7 game against BYU. It was 31-3 against Stanford. Arizona this year averaged 39 points per game as an offense. Held them to 22 on the road. Going into the fourth quarter against UCLA, it was 38-16. Cal, 35-10. Colorado, 49-10 final. 3 picks and 17 total points against Utah. No touchdowns in the second half against Drake May, who's probably going to be a top 5 pick in the 2024 NFL draft. So yes, the defense struggled situationally this year. Yes, they struggled here and there. And I think Chris Hampton is the caliber of coach that you add to try to get you to that next level. And I think there are a lot of personnel changes because Dan Lanning was not content, nor should he have been, with what the defense did this year. But it was not quite as bad as we all remember, just because they somewhat blew it in 2 of the last 3 games of the season that happened to be against Oregon State and Washington. So it stung a little bit extra because we lost to both of them for the first time since 2016. I think that is what needs to be said here contextually to understand how Oregon's defense performed this season. Because those are all scores that you don't build a big lead with one side of the ball. You do it with both sides of the ball. And they did have some really good moments this year. There are games where we're looking for growth. Right? There was a pick 6, which I don't count against the defense against Washington State, but still. 34 points. Yeah, that's too many. 38 to Oregon State. Yeah, that's too many. After 10 points through almost 3 quarters and a couple of picks where they looked really good. And then that's what I was talking about. There was a let up. You had some special teams blunders. Those are the sorts of things that we're trying to clean up. It's not that the staff came in defensively led by Dan Lanning and was just absolutely horrific all year long, and you had to win games like the 2012 USC game 61-52. No, it's nothing like that, right? Aside from the Washington game, 37 points, over 400 passing yards. It was terrible. That was terrible. And those are the sorts of things we're trying to get better, but it's not a total, complete restructuring, though it is from a personnel standpoint, but it's not like the entire defensive philosophy needs to change. You just need some tweaks here and there to get you into that into that next level. So a couple things to wrap up today's show. One of them concerns a Duck who I am most sentimental about for a bevy of reasons. And one concerns a topic that is a follow-up from an earlier question. I will indeed answer those points to end today's show. But if you are asking yourself the question, I want a treat that tastes good and is also delicious, what do I do? The answer is really simple. Built Bars. Had one earlier today on the golf course. Lo and behold, aside from a blow-up, I played pretty well. Not a coincidence. They're loaded with protein. They're loaded with flavor. They keep you going whenever or wherever you need it. Golfing, hiking, walking, exercising. They're good for everything. And they have fantastic flavors covered in 100% real chocolate, churro, peanut butter brownie, coconut almond. Don't wait. You don't need to wait around to get a box. For years, we've been talking about order your Built Bars at Built.com. Now you can get them at your local Walmart or Sam's Club as well. Go check out Built Bars today. All right. I need to get this off my chest. And I know a lot of you are thinking about this as well because it's highly irritating. It's very highly irritating. I love so many things about Justin Herbert. He's awesome. He's a great guy. He was a good student. He's a good locker room guy. And oh, by the way, he's an awesome football player. And he plays on an awesome roster with a coach who's way over his head. He's way over his head. If Dan Lanning did in year 2 with that level of personnel what Brandon Staley did in that playoff game, it would be an indictment of his defensive capability. And that's what it is of Brandon Staley. Because Oregon's defense this year, had those bad games. But guess what? They need a couple personnel upgrades here and there. Specifically on the defensive line with pass rushers, and that's where they're building right now. The Chargers do not. They have Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa. They have Kenneth Murray, who was a high draft pick. They have Derwin James. They have Asante Samuel Jr., went +5 in the turnover department. The Chargers fired Joe Lombardi and their quarterback's coach. Great. Was that the problem? Because last time I checked, they scored 30 points. Yeah, only 3 in the second half. Not good. Or 6 in the second. I don't know, whatever it was. Not good. That's also how just about every NFL game goes. Go watch every Philadelphia Eagles game this year. They play one really good half of football on offense. Sometimes it's been the first, sometimes it's been the second. But the defense is good enough to just hold a team under 20 points. And Brandon Staley in year 2, with that personnel, is having blown coverages and can't get a stop when they need to. He needs a new coach, man. I'm not wild about Joe Lombardi, the OC, but also 30 points in a road playoff game without Mike Williams. It's not that bad. It's not that bad. Do I feel like he fully utilizes Herbert's arm the way Andy Reid does with Mahomes? Nope. Or the Bills with Josh Allen? Nope. But do they do enough? Yeah, they do. But the defense wasn't there. He needs a new coach. And it looks like they're going to stick with him and just bring in a new OC, which it bugs me. As a Duck fan who roots for Herbert every week and will root for him from now until the end of time, as many of you will, it bugs me that the Chargers, number one, that they chargered that game so hard, and number two, that they think the OC was the problem. When their defensive play caller and head coach gave up 31 points in a half of football with elite defensive personnel. I mean, come on. What are we doing here? I don't know. I really don't know. I know many of you are probably feeling the same way about that. I'm right there with you. Right there with you. Closing with a unique question. Last year, my guy Beginner Catholic asked about the virtue that the Oregon football team most needed to adhere to. He was pleased with my response then, and he, in most eloquent fashion, says, "I return seeking your wisdom and desire the answer to be shared on the show, and so you shall have it." She sells seashells by the seashore. Early on, I asked what virtue you thought Oregon players and staff could advance in, and your answer was fair to the ear. I like this medieval language of speaking. I totally approve. I now ask, in the postseason and going forward, which virtue do fans need the most striving after? I thought about this. I examined the available virtues to choose from, and I landed on circumspection. Not that word, circumspection. The ability to examine one's circumstances. College football is a really, really hard thing to win at. So is college basketball. Men looked the way they should last night against Cal. Like seeing that, but I need to see more from them. But the ability to examine the entire roster and everything that goes into a season and everything that needs to go your way, I think is an important mindset for us to carry as fans, because this stuff is hard. Look at how close Oregon was to getting to the playoff last year, and yet how far we felt by the time the season ended. It's because you need so many different moving pieces dealing with 18 to 22-year-old kids to fall into place. And I think the ability to fully examine not just where the program is at or where the roster's at or where the position group is at, but where the entire state of the team is at and where your expectations are at, which is something I'll certainly be talking about with regards to the upcoming schedule. In short, about as good as it could have been for the Ducks. Doesn't make it easy. But I think the ability to look at the whole picture and not get narrow-minded on just this one thing. What was Oregon's biggest defensive need the offseason? Pass rusher. Addressed it. Mateo Uyunglele, probably a day one starter. Jordan Birch, definitely going to be a starter. Bring back Brandon Dorlus. Bring back Casey Rogers. Add a bunch of young freshmen. Maybe one or two of them will get some playing time. But it's easy to look at that and say, well, if you just fix that, everything else is good. Well, no, because you had players leave here. You had players leave there. You're bringing in new players here. You're doing all this sort of stuff. And the ability to take a breath and look at everything to formulate your expectations for the season are something that I plan to help you do here on the show, which is why I appreciate you sticking with me. For those of you who've been with me for a while, for bearing with me through the technological difficulties, the internet. Just had a bad week up in my parents' place. Back in the regular office set up now. All good. Keep the questions rolling in. I've got a bunch of them I have to answer, but guess what? It's a long off season. Ask me anything you like. Appreciate everyone listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much, and go Ducks.